I wanted to say greetings to today's virtual event. This is the book launch for one of Cole's newest publications, Out of School Children, a contemporary view from the Pacific Island countries of the Commonwealth. My name is Kirk Paris, and I'm the Advisor Education at the Commonwealth of Learning, and I support the Regional Centers Initiative at Cole. And one of our regional centers, there's 4, is the Pacific Center for Flexible and Open Learning for Development. And this center was instrumental in moving this publication to what it is. So I'll be the chair and timekeeper for this session. And I should add that this session will be recorded and we'll share the link with you in the coming days. I'd ask if you could keep your microphones muted. That's for all of us, unless you're speaking. And of course, you can raise your hand in the chat as needed. On that point, I'd also encourage people to use the chat to offer any remarks, questions, comments, and you can find that in the toolbar in your Zoom client. The other ask I would request is that if you can change your name, so you can see Tony Mays, Sarishna Narayan, Raylene Esau, my name is Kirk Paris. You can see that people have their names at the bottom. So if you can change that, please do. If you're not sure, that's fine, we'll manage, but that might help us just to speak to people and put names to faces. I know many of you, but I haven't necessarily met with you in person, so that would be helpful. I'm joined today by several colleagues at Cole. These individuals will be speaking today. Professor Asha Kanwar, she's the president and CEO of the Commonwealth of Learning. We have Dr. V. Balaji, he is the vice president of the Commonwealth of Learning that's joining us. My colleague, Dr. Tony Mays, who is the education specialist for open schooling, is here, and I will be chairing, but he and I will be co-presenting in various sections of today's program. From the University of the South Pacific, where PACFold is located, we're joined by Dr. Rajni Chand. She's the director of PACFold and the director of the Center for Flexible Learning. And her colleague, Ms. Sarishna Narayan, who is the lead author on this publication. And she's the project officer at the Center for Flexible Learning. We also have Professor Anne Cheryl Armstrong from the School of Education and the Associate Dean of Research, Innovation, and International. We're also joined by 2 eminent academics, former USP colleagues, Professor Derek Armstrong, former Deputy Vice Chancellor at USP, and Dr. Sam Naidu, the former Pro Vice Chancellor at USP, who is also instrumental in moving this publication to what it is. He's listed with myself and Tony as one of the editors that supported Sarishna in this endeavor. Last but not least, and in fact the most important of all, are our focal points and other contributors that made this publication possible. I will be speaking more to you later on, but these individuals, for those that don't know, were really the linchpins to get this publication underway. They were the ones that did the groundwork to collect the necessary data that we find throughout the pages of this publication. You've all seen this program, and so I won't spend too much time on it. We have 7 items to go through, and once I'm finished, we're going to I'll gesture to my president, Professor Kanwar, to offer some welcome remarks, along with Dr. Chand. And then we'll move through the agenda accordingly with these other agenda items. So without further ado, I will invite Professor Asha Kanwar to offer some welcome remarks. Over to you, Professor Kanwar.
Thank you, Kirk. And dear colleagues, dear friends, I'm really delighted to be part of this virtual launch for the book on out-of-school children in the Pacific. This is, of course, a joint effort of my organization, the Commonwealth of Learning, and PACFold, the Pacific Center for Flexible and Open Learning for Development, at, of course, USP. This is one of our 4 regional centers. You know, the other 3 regional centers that we have are in Botswana, Nigeria, and Malta. And this publication is, symbolic of the regional work that these kinds of centers do. So we are very grateful that this has happened. And of course, I remember still that, in the days when in-person activities were still possible, PACFold was formally inaugurated in Samoa. And at that time, Professor Rajesh Chandra was the Vice Chancellor. I was there, and this was done in the presence of the Minister of Education in Samoa. And of course, since then, it's become a regional hub for capacity building in open distance and flexible learning in the region. And it's really significant that I can see both the former director of PACFOLD and my friend, Dr. Som Naidu, who, of course, as we've just heard from Kirk, is an editor of this book, and his successor, Dr. Rajni Chand. We are very grateful to the many who've contributed to this book, and some of you are present today. All 9 Pacific Island countries of the Commonwealth responded to the survey that was sent out 1 year ago. At the time, the intention was to conduct an environmental scan of the situation of out-of-school children in the region. We weren't sure then how many people would, get back to us, but you'll be happy to note that all 9 countries responded. And I think this is really all thanks to the hard work of our 9 call focal points in each member state, because either directly or by approaching your colleagues, each one of you focal points invested time and energy to do the necessary research and compile data for this important work. Several of you also agreed to participate in interviews, adding another level of richness to the publication. Dear focal points and contributors, please accept my heartfelt gratitude and appreciation. At the time of collating all this survey data, my colleagues at CALL, Dr. Kirk Perez and Dr. Tony Mays, who have worked very hard to make this happen, engaged with our PACFOLD counterparts to consider compiling a collection of case studies as a book. So they're very ambitious people, as you know. The aim was to provide a comprehensive view of the situation of out-of-school children in the region, which is quite a significant departure from the previously intended environmental scan. Without hesitation, PACFOLD colleagues agreed, and Dr. Naidu nominated Shrishna Narayan, who, as we know, is a project officer at USP, to accept this major task. It was Shrishna who devoted all her energies to do the desk research, conduct interviews, and ultimately write each case study and develop the content into a book. So congratulations, Shrishna, and well done. Thank you really for all your hard work and dedication. Let us now reflect on the social realities that this book captures in the 9 member states. Half the population in the region is under 25. So we know it's a young region, and this demographic dividend can only be realized if young people have learning opportunities. As we all know, education is the surest pathway to social mobility and a better quality of life. Most countries in the region have made tremendous strides in primary education, and trends indicate that this progress will be sustained. But what of sustainable access to secondary school and the school leavers who missed out on completing their formal schooling? The numbers of out-of-school children remains a significant problem, and we know that limited resources often restrict opportunities, and innovative approaches are required to ameliorate these disparities of access. Many learners, as we know, are dispersed in remote geographical regions with limited access to resources and connectivity. CALL and PACFOLD focus their efforts on leveraging technological solutions to enable access to quality learning for such learners. We believe that open schooling can provide flexible options for quality secondary education at lower costs. At least 27 countries in the Commonwealth are implementing different models of open schools, and based on its unique context, we hope that new models will emerge in the Pacific, which will also be relevant for the Caribbean. The COVID-19 pandemic has disrupted over 90% of students worldwide, resulting in learning losses and massive dropout rates. Girls are at a higher risk of dropping out in the post-pandemic period. So how can we provide both boys and girls the opportunity to have flexible opportunities where they can have access to quality education? We have learned some hard lessons during this time, but this may actually lead us to modernize and overhaul our education systems for the 21st century. Governments will need to invest more in technology than in brick and mortar solutions. During the pandemic, a range of technologies were deployed: print, radio, TV, and the internet. While there is an uneven development of technology in the different countries in the Pacific, access to the internet is increasing rapidly. One insight from the pandemic is that technology-enabled learning will be an integral part of teaching and learning, and blended approaches will be the new norm. Education systems will need to adopt open, distance, and flexible learning, build the capacity of educators, strengthen infrastructure, and develop supportive policies. The pandemic has also underscored the importance of equity considerations at all levels of education and training. Because of the digital divide, technology must be placed in an appropriate social, cultural, and political context. Governments and institutions need to develop policies that address the needs of the last person in the queue. And who's the last person of the queue? Out of school youth, those in remote regions, and persons with disabilities. These are very big challenges, but together they can be addressed. We look forward to further strengthening our partnership with PACFOLD to make a difference in the region. As you know, PAUL is your organization and it works for you. Please make full use of our expertise and resources to develop open schools so that every child has access to 12 years of quality education. This book that we launched today will be the basis for a very targeted and informed approach to make this a reality. So with those few words, let me thank you kindly, and it's so good to see everyone. Back to you, Kirk.
Thank you, Professor Kanwar, for those remarks. And now I'd like to invite Dr. Rajni Chand to offer some welcoming remarks as well.
Thank you, Kirk. The President and the CEO of Commonwealth of Learning, Professor Asha Kanwar, Dr. Tony Myers, Dr. Craig Perez, Professor Som Naidu, Sarishna, the regional focal points, other experts from Commonwealth of Learning, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a pleasure to launch a book on PICS, on an issue that is so close to the hearts of so many of us in this region. It gives me great pleasure to see the likes of experts such as Professor Som Naidu, Professor Derek Armstrong, and Associate Professor Anne Sherrill making their contributions on issues they are experts in. During better times, we would have had a real book launch. However, the current constraints due to COVID-19 situation and cases in Fiji has added to the challenges that PICS and OOC face in the region. Collectively, 50.9% of PICS countries' population are below the age of 24. What these countries do, the challenges they face in providing much needed education for this age group is crucial for the future of all these countries and the region. This report is an eye-opener for all the researchers in education, ministries of education in PICS, teachers, parents, education providers as well as education receivers, because it includes much needed data on what works, what doesn't, and where education in this region is concerned, what do we collectively, and especially from PACFOLD, can do. It gives me great pleasure to assure that whatever the outcomes are, this is an eye-opener for us at PACFOLD, and we look forward to providing more support as well as trying to give as much support and support as well as avenues for these regional countries in doing what they are for the out of school children. Thank you very much for giving me the time.
Thank you for those remarks, Dr. Chand. And want like now just to continue to our program. And I'm going to now invite my colleague, Dr. Tony Mays, to speak about the origins of the project and really the big picture to frame it as to why this is important. Tony, over to you.
Thank you, Kirk. Colleagues, good morning, good evening, and due protocols observed. I managed Cole's open schooling portfolio, so I was very interested and excited to enter into a collaboration with our regional centers portfolio to explore an aspect of open schools potential in the Pacific. We had a sense that the 9 Pacific Island countries had made great progress with respect to provision of primary school education, but that there was a problem with transition from primary to secondary and from junior secondary to senior secondary. However, we found it quite difficult to get hold of contemporary up-to-date data on the nature and size of the challenge, and hence we commissioned this study. Next slide. So once we understand what a problem is, we can then make use of open schooling approaches using open distance and e-learning methods to address it. There are many reasons why children drop out of school or do not succeed in school or cannot access school in the first place. So knowing where the problem is the starting point for designing an intervention that will be appropriate. Next slide. Generally speaking, there are 2 major approaches to addressing these kinds of challenges. If the nature of the problem focuses on children of school-going age who cannot access schooling who are not succeeding in schooling, we would typically develop responses that are complementary to the normal school curriculum. If, however, the focus of the challenge is older learners, youth who have dropped out of schooling or not succeeded, then we would typically look for an alternative kind of curriculum that would meet their slightly different needs. In the Caribbean, we have an example of a curriculum that matches both. Part of the curriculum looks at literacy and numeracy that is more schooling oriented, more academic, and then part of the curriculum is more vocational. Next slide. As Professor Kanwa has noted, that there are open schooling initiatives of various kinds in about 27 countries. And here are 4 examples of very big ones in India, in Namibia, here in Vancouver, and in New Zealand, where the existence of an open school was utilized to support the whole school system in terms of resources and ways of mediating more flexible kinds of learning, building on a rich history of different open schooling provisions. So there's different types of open school for different contexts. Next slide. Typically what we would do when we work with a country is begin with a needs analysis. So once we know that a country has identified an issue, we want to burrow down into that challenge to try and understand where it comes from and what the particular focus should be of our intervention. And that would lead into some kind of baseline study that will give us direction for moving forward. Then we would typically do some work on curriculum-based OER content development, training teachers, managers, IT people, policymakers, to create a conducive learning environment. We would then usually support a small-scale pilot to see what can work or what does not work. And then we take the positive lessons of experience through into supporting the potential for scaling. Next slide. If we begin to imagine post-COVID, we can probably think of a schooling system that looks more like this model here, where we have a strong focus on face-to-face schooling, especially for younger learners, where our senior secondary learners are beginning to work through more hybrid blended approaches. In Mozambique, for example, it's fairly typical for schools to have 2 cohorts in a day, 1 cohort in the morning and 1 cohort in the afternoon, so thus potentially doubling the number of secondary school students who can be reached. But always there are some learners who cannot access these opportunities. So we also need to think about a more flexible open schooling model for those as well. If we're using a complementary curriculum, then the resources we develop for that curriculum can be used in all three modes of delivery, and so maximize the impact that we can have. Next slide. We already have 2 projects underway in the Pacific region. In Vanuatu, we're looking at the potential of curriculum-based OER and after-school support for out-of-school youth. Unfortunately, the education system in Vanuatu was closed down for most of last year, so we're beginning to resurrect it again this year. And we're currently just about to finish an exploratory project with FODI and the Ministry of Education in Papua New Guinea, where we're exploring the potential for moving from face-to-face and print-based learning to more online learning. So we're beginning to have some lessons of experience from the region, which we can feed into any subsequent interventions. And we look forward to the possibility of working with more countries in the days and months that follow. Kirk, I think over to you.
Thank you, Tony. So I'm just going to close out this portion with just a few quick remarks about the overarching goals of the project. And of course, naturally, one of them was to ascertain the contemporary context of out-of-school children in the Commonwealth states of the Pacific. I want to more talk about next steps, and I'll expand on that later, as well. I think Sam will also touch on that. But really, we want to think about how we can engage in some knowledge mobilization. How can we really exploit the contents of this book to move towards interventions? So I just want to foreshadow that, and it was mentioned previously about workshopping this book down the road. And I think that is what is coming up in a few moments' time with the open facilitated discussion. We really want to lean on our Pacific member colleagues that were involved in this project to really offer some insight about areas of priority that we should focus, that we can move towards workshopping, and downstream ultimately to look at interventions, as has been happening in Vanuatu, as Tony just alluded to. I'll stop there, and I'm going to invite Dr. Sam Naidu and Ms. Sharishna Narayan to speak to the conceptualization and the development of this important work. Sam and Sharishna, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Kirk. Greetings, everyone. It's great to see you all at this time, and I'm going to talk more specifically, along with Sharishna, about the book and about the project. I'll start off with a few comments and then hand it over to Sharishna, who will talk more specifically about the findings, because as Professor Kanwar said, that she was the person who actually did the work. And while I'm saying that, I would like to acknowledge the contributions of the University of the South Pacific and PACFOLD for making available Sharishna's time during 2020, when she and I, and along with Kirk Paris and Tony Mays, worked intensively on this project. As Tony had foreshadowed, we didn't start off to write a book per se. We started to work on a deficit that was obvious, as Tony has identified, which was the lack of data on open schooling, or not necessarily open schooling, but schooling and problems with schooling in the Pacific Islands. So that was the intention. So the project began with the goals. Let me just go to the first slide to identify the barriers that school children were facing in the Pacific, as well as, look at the policies that were in place or should be in place or were not in place. So that was the purpose of the study, to produce some kind of baseline data, or not necessarily some kind, as best as possible, on the state of schooling in the 9 Pacific Islands of the Commonwealth. So that's how the project began. So we started working on it, and obviously, things developed as we went along. And obviously, at that time, we thought that a mixed methods approach would be the best way to attack this task. So we developed a questionnaire in the usual sense through the processes, and tried to collect quantitative data. And as Professor Kanwar was saying, we were very delighted that all 9 focal points came to the party and responded to the survey, because without their input, we wouldn't have had that data. And then we followed that up with interviews, and also a large part of the study was trying to look at existing data, not just specifically from the governments or non-governmental organizations, but also from donor agencies like UNESCO and ADB and those sorts of organizations. So Srishna is the person who actually forayed all that those resources, and we would try to be as rigorous as possible. Obviously, one of the reasons why we invited Professor Armstrong here, because he was DVC researcher at that time at the University of the South Pacific, and we followed all the protocols. Questionnaires were developed and validated and distributed using SurveyMonkey, and interviews were conducted properly by way of questions that had been developed and validated amongst colleagues at the university. So we did consult with people in the social sciences who were working in the area of youth empowerment and capacity building, as well as in the schools of education at the university, to seek their feedback on our approach to gathering this data. So that's how we began the study. Now I'm going to hand it over to Srishna to actually talk about some of the findings, the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, and then I'll come and finish it off with the recommendations that have come out of this study. Over to you, Srishna.
Greetings, everybody. I'm going to briefly provide an analysis of the state of out-of-school children in the Pacific, the barriers and obstacles that prevent and restrict children from attending school, and finally some proposed recommendations that came out of the study. But before I do that, let me define what out-of-school means. Out-of-school children mean. Out-of-school children include children of primary, lower secondary, and upper secondary school age. They may have been unable to access formal learning for a variety of reasons and dropped out of schools. Others may have started formal schooling but encountered disruptions, and that prevented them from continuing their education. The purpose of this survey was to ascertain the current situation of out-of-school children in the Commonwealth Pacific Island countries. So I will briefly talk about the demographic data from the survey. Out of the 9 respondents, 6 were from government departments. That is the Department of Education, followed by 2 respondents who were from public education or training institutes, while 1 was from a non-governmental organization. So we move on to the next slide. So the first question in the survey sought to explore the seriousness of out-of-school children in each of the 9 Pacific Island countries. Data revealed that all the countries in the region face, major challenges with children dropping out of primary, lower secondary, or upper secondary education before the end of the last grade, or some of them never enroll at all at senior levels. The problem seems to be particularly acute at lower and upper secondary levels rather than primary levels for countries such as Papua New Guinea, Kiribati, and Nauru. The interviews, also reveal that gender disparities that relate to unequal, participation in education for boys and girls exist in Kiribati and Fiji. It states that, dropout rates for boys are higher than girls in these countries. The next slide. One of the main objectives for this study was to identify the reasons children dropped out of schools. The survey results revealed a number of barriers and bottlenecks in education that often prevents children from attending school. And these were related to low academic performance of students, where students had poor academic results, and they would subsequently drop out of schools. And the study also revealed that students who could not keep up with the curriculum, especially their transition from primary to lower secondary, due to probably encountering completely new teaching methods or learning approach, they would drop out of the education system. The survey and the interview results revealed that natural disasters now occur more frequently in the Pacific, and all the countries in the study are susceptible to these challenges. The analysis of secondary data confirmed that access to education was challenged when schools would be damaged by a natural disaster, and the school facilities would be used as emergency evacuation centers for extended periods of time. In countries such as Fiji, Tonga, Vanuatu, Papua New Guinea. School-based violence, such as peer bullying, corporal punishment, verbal abuse, and other forms of violence, contribute to, reduce school attendance and low academic performance. In certain countries, secondary data suggests that corporal punishment, verbal abuse, and harassment affect, the quality of education and force the children to drop out of school. There is also evidence that suggests that peer bullying is quite serious in some countries such as Samoa, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, and Tonga. Other reasons related to education systems, such as lack of stimulating learning environment, lack of effort on the part of the teachers to care for underperforming students who were at risk of dropping out, and poor quality of inclusive education for children with disabilities, shortage of teachers, especially in STEM subjects in countries such as Fiji and Papua New Guinea, teacher absenteeism, lack of teaching and learning resources, and lack of appropriate infrastructure, such as functional classrooms, such as labs, and other resources, being missing eventually, contributes to children being excluded from education. Even with school fee abolition in most of the countries in this study, there are some children who are most vulnerable, who still experience higher exclusion due to the indirect costs that are associated with schooling. And according to the results of this survey, this seems to be a particular serious concern in countries such as Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. Additionally, stakeholders from Fiji and Nauru indicated that during the interviews, they indicated that children drop out because they lose interest in school, as the curriculum is too theoretical and exam oriented. Next slide, please. Next, so questions were asked in order to explore the existing strategies and interventions that have been used in these countries to reduce the dropout rates. In the case studies, secondary data, as well as the response to this question, illustrate that over the past few decades, all these 9 countries have made considerable effort to make education accessible and create opportunities for schooling for all the children and youth. The results of this survey reveal that various approaches to bring as many children and young people as possible into school have taken various forms. With that includes the use of inclusive teaching strategies coupled with the effective and high quality teaching, the provision of viable pathways to students to pursue alternative or further education, and the provision of transport and tuition fee subsidies to children in order to address this issue. Some examples are tuition fee grant scheme in Fiji, free primary and secondary education in countries such as Kiribati and Nauru. Even though partner countries reported that access to education had increased in most cases, they also acknowledge that reducing the number of out of school children was still a major challenge, probably because of the key policies and initiatives that actually target these children are not fully implemented. Factors such as I'm sorry, just give me 1 minute. Next slide, please. So the next question explored the extent to which second chance learning opportunities or alternative pathways are, provided to children, to students who are or were unable to complete secondary education. So just quickly define second chance education. Second chance education addresses the needs of individuals who dropped out of schools for a variety of reasons, but still wish to complete their education. Such programs are not only flexible, that is the teaching and learning are not, they're not subject to limitations of place, time, or place of study, but they also offer opportunities to learn for a diverse group of learners. All the 9 countries acknowledge that the conventional, education system cannot adequately address the issue of, access to education, especially for the disadvantaged and the marginalized. And in order to expand the path to basic education for those who have dropped out of schools, there is a genuine need to introduce flexible learning strategies. So the survey revealed, indicated that there are second chance opportunities that are provided across the Pacific Island countries to reverse or counteract dropout rates. A high proportion of respondents indicated that a number of second chance educational opportunities are always provided who have dropped out, such as technical vocational education and education and training provided by NGOs, community-based education for youth. And they also revealed that that open schooling is rarely or never used to address the issue of out-of-school children. 8 out of 9 participants stated that. Next slide.
Sorry, Suresh, I'm just being cognizant of time, and the next 2
Okay.
slides are about the IT.
Okay.
So I'll leave it to you about what you should maybe highlight, but do let me know when we could perhaps shift to the recommendation slide.
Okay, so I'll just talk about the professional development activities, and then maybe we can just move to recommendations, if that's okay.
Yeah. Are you still speaking, Sarishna, or are you done?
No, I was going to go over the next few slides, but it's okay if we are running out of time. I think the most important ones, that we should have discussed, I have already discussed the reasons for dropout rates, and what has been done in the countries to, to address the issue. So I'm okay to leave the rest of the slides.
I think if I can just this up. I too am keen to hear from other
Okay.
other participants on what on the work that has been done and the data that has been presented. Obviously, the book is online, and this is easily accessible by any one of us to interrogate that more intensively. But as Kirk was foreshadowing, the question is, what do we do with this data? Where are we going with this? And with people like Kirk and Tony and colleagues around the table, I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about. But just to highlight on a couple of recommendations that came out of this study, and we will add more to this. Obviously, there was interest in second chance opportunities, and it was very interesting to find that open schooling is not being considered as as, as a solution to the problems that have been identified. So there's obviously an opportunity there. Uh, and adoption, integration of flexible learning. So what does that mean and how is it going to roll out? And also technology, as Professor Conroy was saying, technology is becoming more widely available and will get better. So I think we should look at the positives rather than the negatives. And issues around inclusive education, and I'm sure that includes disability, people with disabilities and disadvantages, so on and so on, which I'm sure Professor Conroy, Professor Armstrong's will talk more about. One of the things that did come out, and I don't think we should, and it's not widespread in the Pacific, but in some island countries, is the issue of violence. It's not uncommon. We see violence in schools in other parts of the world as well, but that is something that also came out of this study and how to deal with it where there is prevalent. So these were some of the recommendations, and I want to throw that in the mix alongside what else might come up as part of the conversations later on, Kurt. So that's about it from us for the time being.
Great. Thank you to Suresh and Tasam for your presentation, capturing the major findings in the book. I'm going to invite Professor Derek Armstrong and Professor Anne Cheryl Armstrong to offer some remarks. They read the book, and being experts in the space of education and inclusivity, we look forward to hearing some of your remarks. Over to you, to Professor Armstrong and Professor Anne Armstrong.
Bulavanaka. Lovely to be here. Thank you, Sharishna, and thank you, core colleagues, for inviting us. Now, the book is really timely, very important. I want to shift the conversation slightly in terms of contextualizing people in the Pacific or learners from the Pacific. So out of school children form a community of learners who in the Pacific learn via practical activities and the oral tradition. Now, this is not dismissing OERs or any of the online interventions, but it's contextualizing the way we understand how these people live. They are differently abled, these out of school learners. They are not dunce or disabled. So that point speaks to labeling perceptions and attitudes. And this group to whom we are offering a second chance must not be seen as a group of societal misfits or charity cases, because it's very easy to do that. And if we look at just an example of things like truancy, bullying, disability, they were seen as societal misfits and charity cases. So it's easy to apply those labels. So it's important to avoid deficit labels and perceptions and reframe the way we see learners. They are learners, we need to reframe them, and they are an important part of society because we are responsible as educators for where they end up. They don't end up there just because. So the focus should be on the educational needs that need to be met. So instead of categorizing children into categories of normality, disability, non-disabled, we should be looking at educational needs. So what are those educational needs that this particular group may have? And what are the reasons for out of school children being out of school? So in the data that was presented, some examples were from PNG and Nauru, two different countries. and therefore the reasons for them being out of school would be different. We have a very tiny country, massive country. What exactly are the drivers that allow these young people to be out of school? How do we know what approaches we should use with these young people? Well, the learners themselves should be allowed to use their voice. So education becomes a process that is pursued with the learner rather than something that is done to the learner. The question then becomes, what is the intervention that is developed that supports a community way of being, doing, and knowing that is engaging and honors the varying ability of the learners? The thing that's interesting for me is looking at the Pacific as a whole and where we are at this point in time. There is something called the Pacific Regional Inclusive Education Framework, which is part of the Pacific Regional Education Framework. And the approach is an inclusive approach, at least it is hoped that it is an inclusive approach. And it is geared towards understanding or reframing education, as I alluded to, and bringing all the learners on board. The last thing that I would want to say is I would make reference to the PILNA, so it's the Pacific Islands Literacy and Numeracy Assessment. They do a lot of work in terms of what's happening on the ground in education and some of the issues around education. And I think that the PILNA report could feed into the findings of this book. Thank you very much. I now hand you over to Derek.
Sharon. Just one or two points I want to add and complement what Anne Cheryl said. I mean, firstly, I'd like to congratulate Sharishna and the team on the study. I mean, we really suffer from a paucity of data in education in the Pacific, as in a number of countries. Mm-hmm. But this study is really strong in terms of data and provides a really good insight into the countries concerned. And I'll obviously be interested to hear what the representatives of different countries have to say in the discussion, but it certainly is some good data presented here. I think that there are still gaps in the data, and I think it's interesting to think about how we go on to develop interventions as we go forward, because it seems to me that the data process and data collection process and data analysis process is an iterative process. So as we develop interventions and start to talk about and plan interventions, there is a need to validate them further with further collection and analysis of data, and possibly to bring in therefore some groups who have not been brought into this up to this point. And I think that's particularly in relation to children themselves, and to learners themselves, mm-hmm. to families, to cultural and community representatives. And I think there's a need to see as we go forward, and this is not a criticism of the study as it is, it's a thinking about the future as it goes forward, is a need to think about how we broaden out those different perspectives and understandings in ways which allow us to really develop those interventions on this strong basis of this study. And I think one point might be to consider the way that out-of-school children is not simply something we should see in terms of as risk or something in terms of disadvantage and deficit, although often it is about disadvantage, of course, but also there's choices in this as well. And families and children make choices, and one needs to understand the context in which these things happen to see why children or why families are not choosing education as one of their choices. So it's something to explore further, I think, in terms of the data. I think the second point I want to make is in terms of the role and importance of informal learning in the societies of the Pacific, where there is so much learning takes place within the community. So much cultural learning and knowledge takes place within the community. There is always a risk that there's a tension between school knowledge and community knowledge. And that's something which I think needs some consideration as we develop further interventions and responses to the challenges that are faced. So that's so that's something I think which we might benefit for some further data collection, further analysis, further discussion in particular with a wide range of people. And then the final point I want to make is about the role of teacher education. And it speaks in a way to the tension between formal learning and informal learning again, is the way in which teachers understand their role in the context of learning, their relationship to the students they're working with, and how professional development, and particularly how the training and preparation and continuing professional learning of teachers is supported in a culturally appropriate way and in ways which really speak to and support and enhance inclusive education and learning opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you both to Dr. or Professor Anne Sherrill and Professor Derek Armstrong for your remarks and insight to complement what exists in the book and perhaps to extrapolate on further areas of intervention, if not research. I want to just acknowledge we're a little bit behind schedule, but at the same time, I think the most important part of today's session is really to invite and to hear from our country partners. So if everyone's comfortable just going maybe 10, 15 minutes past the hour, we'd be greatly appreciative of that, given that we still want to, again, hear from our country partners. On that note, just as we're moving along, we're at the point where we want to have a discussion with focal points and additional those country level contributors. So some of the focal points were levers to invite some of their colleagues to collect the data and to support this work. So on that note, we do have some of our colleagues from Tonga, from Nauru, from Tuvalu, Kiribati, and I think that's it. If I've missed anyone, I apologize, but certainly you can correct me. We want to open the discussion to you to see what sort of comments, insights, questions you might have based on the report, or excuse me, the publication that was shared, and or the conversations that have happened today. So the floor is open. We have some prepared questions to maybe prompt the discussion, but perhaps there are some pressing questions or comments that people have at this time. So the floor is open for anyone to offer any remarks. And I won't be the school teacher that calls on you. I think maybe people consider what they want to say. Maybe Tony and Som and Sarishna, maybe any reflections on what we heard from Professor Derek and Professor Anne Sherrill, or any other thoughts that have perhaps surfaced as we've talked. We've had these discussions.
If I can jump in just to fill in the void for a little bit, I think some of the points that Derek mentioned are very important. I'm reflecting back on the work that we did in 2020. We didn't want to broaden it. We couldn't broaden it out too much because we had to keep the project within some confines, within some parameters, so that we could do the work, but and complete it. So this is, as Derek was saying, it's an iterative process. We've got one sort of data from the focal points who have looked at their countries as a whole and the policies and the administrative issues around schooling and people's inabilities. But I think we should, in the next step, bring in community leaders and parents themselves, and as well as school children, if we can do that. And I'm going to factor that into the next steps in the project to see how we can capture the data. Capturing that data is going to be hard. So I'm going to lean on the focal points to sort of help us do that, because you are the guys on the ground there. You know who the parents we should be talking to, the children who should be talking to, the community leaders who should be talking to. So I think I want to put that out and see if that can be done with your help.
I think Am I unmuted? Sorry, just Raylan. I think did you want Dr. Raylan from Tonga? Did you want to offer any remarks?
Thank you, Dr. Paris. I just wanted to, on behalf of my Honorable Minister, I just want to thank the team for the hard work done and the excellent report that has been provided. And I think with this work that we have on hand, since we don't have the doctors Armstrong, about what we can do to move forward. But I just want to appreciate the work that you have done so far, and I also like to acknowledge the work of the former colleague who was the focal point for Tonga, Mrs. Sipola Halafihi, who is now being allocated to another position in the ministry, and I've just started in January. But I'm quite excited seeing this report because there's a lot of participated, but also we're looking to the future. What else can we do with the data? It's already informing some things that are already happening on the ground, like here in Tonga, when we talk about second chance education, we do have a class started last year, a class that we all, wow, so that started last year, and it's very new. Also, on another development from Tonga, we have made arrangements with a generous approval and endorsement of the head of Commonwealth of Learning to explore more on boys' education, the performance of our boys in Tonga. It's compared to girls. It is problematic. So we have the gender specialists from the Commonwealth of Learning working with us to help us on work on work on that. So with that, I just wanted to thank Dr. Paris and the team, Dr. Naidu and your team for this excellent work that you've done and the publication. And I'm hoping that this won't be the end. This will be the beginning of networking and looking at more areas in research and the gaps that we can explore further. And Tonga is ready to support you in any way we can. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Allen. If I could probe a bit, just curious, we do see this pattern as well in the Caribbean around boys' underperformance in education. I was just curious to know if you could expand on maybe some of the reasons for that. And then I might also gesture to our other partners in Tuvalu, Nauru, or Kiribati to maybe offer any remarks that might be of comparison. But please, any insight on that around boys' underperformance?
Thank you, Dr. Paris. Well, we say anecdotal evidence, it's culture, it's the way we treat our girls and boys. That's what we say. I remember some years back, I accompanied my minister to one of the foreign education ministers meeting, and it was brought up in the forum of the honorable ministers. And what the remarks that we heard from the ministers, that from Polynesian countries, it's the girls that are doing better, and in the Melanesian countries, it's the opposite. So that was the talk, and we're wanting to do more research, but since then, nothing has really come to surface. Just until recently, our minister, who is on the board, had requested, and so we've been granted that opportunity, that we're getting assistance from the Commonwealth of Learning to help us explore the underperformance of the boys here in Tonga. Thank you.
Good, thank you, Dr. Raylan. Thank you, Raylan. Any of our colleagues from Tuvalu, Nauru, Kiribati, I'm curious to know if you had any issues around gender that you've seen that perhaps would be relevant to the discussion around what Dr. Raylan has also mentioned. We don't want to, of course, force anyone to speak, but it's more about what resonates in terms of some of the topics of concern. It might help as well if you unmute, if you do want to speak so we don't miss you, to unmute your microphone, again, if you choose. And I'll continue to monitor that. Hello, Art. From Kiribati, I believe. Is that right, Mr. Can you introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Tekonan. from Kiribati. I'm teaching at the Kiribati Teachers College at the moment. I just want to, yes, to thank you, thank the call for this is a wonderful report, and those who have contributed to it in writing up the findings. I just want to add some issues like what the one from Tonga, Dr. I cannot remember her name. Is but by comparing the gender in Kiribati, we have the same case as the girls are performing better than the boys. But in terms of dropout, there are more girls who are dropping out from school as opposed to the boys. That's our case in Kiribati. So that's what I just want to add, in terms of that, the performance and the dropout from school.
And any ideas on why there is that discrepancy between the genders?
First of all, I think there's has to do with the school system. There's one recent research that has been conducted by the local person, and in your findings, he discovered that the school system in Kiribati is more like a feminist, in terms that they are more catering for the needs of the girls.
I see. Thank you. Thank you for those remarks. Oh, please, continue.
Yeah, I think that's all I want to say, and I want to thank you again for this and those who have prepared this report and published it for their contribution and artwork.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
I think Professor Ann Cheryl, did you want to offer some remarks? You just muted there.
It's in the chat, thank you. All I was saying is that it's a process of socialization. So boys are socialized differently from girls. They're given freedom to roam, and the girls feel, well, how can we contribute? And they focus on their education. And I suspect in the Pacific, it works both ways. So when you have social situations where girls are expected to do particular types of duties, then perhaps they're not, school is then not seen as the priority. So I think it has to do with cultural socialization. Thanks.
And given that, I mean, Professor Derek also touched on that so much is culturally nuanced. How do you see that being ameliorated or being addressed? These issues of cultural, embedded cultural values that could perhaps be a deterrent or can slow the progress of whether it's males or females, but you've spoken more to females.
Okay, we both say something. I think one of the ways of doing that is to use culturally appropriate methods of engagement. So you use Maniapa, Talk Story, Talanoa, so the methods that people resonate with in terms of specific research and cultural engagement. You also look for people who are identified as key people, gatekeepers. You engage with the churches. Churches are really important in the Pacific. And you want to get into a community, you work with the churches to get an insider perspective because they have links to families and the hierarchical system. I think at this point, that's sorry, I stole Derek's thunder. That's what he wanted to say as well.
We think alike so much.
Thank you. I saw Raylan shaking her head in acknowledgement.
Very good. Tony or Sam or Sarishna, do you have any comments at this point? I think we can offer maybe a few more minutes and then we could move to wrap up. But this has been a good discussion. I've got some new ideas that I was not necessarily privy to But yes, please, anyone else have any remarks or comments?
Well, the obvious one, of course, is that, if people had any afterthoughts, please just email to Tony or Kirk or even me, and we'll incorporate that. I mean, the challenge is really what is the next thing? What should we be doing? And people on the ground are the people. I mean, it's one thing to talk about, the differences in acculturation and problems that we're facing. But what do we do about it? What can we do about it? What should we do about it? And I want that to be, well, it's important that is coming out from the focal points and from people on the ground, because otherwise, we would be spending minimal resources somewhat not so wisely. So please feel free to send us any thoughts, because as someone was saying, this is just the beginning, and this is baseline data, and there's a lot of work to be done, and we're prepared to do that. Yes, Terry.
I mean, just one point on that. I mean, I think if we're gonna go forward with some further workshops and in terms of thinking and planning about this, I just want to emphasize the importance of co-design, and that is in co-design with a number of stakeholders, possibly who are not normally involved in co-design processes in countries. And Cheryl mentioned churches. I mean, churches have a big role in education across the Pacific, and I think not only key stakeholders, but have a major contribution to making this sphere and to be part of the debate, discussion, and development, and of course parents and representatives of disabled people's organisations and people like that, who are not always involved in these discussions. I think it's important to create the space where they feel comfortable being part of the discussion. Mm-hmm. And again, I think this goes back to the issue of using specific methodologies to have these types of discussions, not simply the traditional workshop discussion, but thinking through that process of engagement, how we do that in the most effective way to get the benefit of those people's contributions and support and engagement with the process, and to value it in the way that it needs to be valued.
Can I just add something very quickly? If you look at the tenders that are going out in the Pacific at this point in time, one of the things that they all say is that they do not want a cookie cutter approach, because they're beginning to recognize it's like the Caribbean. You can't say the Caribbean and expect everybody to have the same culture. It's like you cannot say the Pacific and expect everybody to have the same culture. They are, and even though like we cut them up and we say Polynesians, Micronesians, and Melanesians, even within the countries themselves, there are nuances. So it's how do we address the needs in a wholesome, progressive manner that's engaging, but how do we also respect the cultures of the people? And it's a sort of thin line. But it can be done. I think it can be done because we do it in some of the education courses, at least the ones that I run. That's what we do. Thank you.
So I think just being respectful for time, we went a bit over and I said we'd try and wrap up within 15 minutes after the hour. So I just wanted to thank everyone for your comments and your contributions. I will be following up with all of our partners that were able to attend today. And on that point as well, we've got Dr. Naidoo to help us run a collection of workshops. We're going to be running 3 workshops starting in the end of May to really flesh out ideas and to continue this conversation to really pinpoint what are your needs and really what are the priorities and to find out where there might be some crossover across different country contexts, to find if there is, as much as possible, a general or universal approach with obviously recognition of co-design, as Professor Derek had mentioned, and trying to also recognize the localization piece, as Professor Ann Cheryl had mentioned. And naturally, I'll be admitted, there's obviously tensions there to look at between what is general and what is specific or local. But in any event, the premise, and that resonates with what we do at Cole, as Dr. Armstrong or Professor Derrick had said, around co-design. So we will be inviting you to participate in a series of online workshops, and or your other constituents and or colleagues to take part in this. And the idea is to develop a sense of ideas and proposed interventions that Cole and Packfold downstream could help to support. And that could be, Dr. Rayland already spoke to this about another intervention that Cole is working on with gender. We would be mapping that more towards the open schooling context. I'll stop there to see if Tony or Som or Sarishna have any other final remarks before I move to my last slide. Som, I think we're clear. Tony, anything else that you'd like to
Just
add?
want to say thank you to everybody. I've been trying to capture questions that have arisen as a result of the discussion. And I go back to saying there is no one size fits all. And so, yes, this is a starting of a journey, this publication. We will take it forward in due course. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Tony. So my last slide is really just to acknowledge all of our focal points, all of our other contributors that made this publication possible. I touched on this at the beginning, and it's been Professor Kanwar mentioned this as well, as have a few others. Here's the list, and we're fortunate to have with us today excuse me, of course, we have Dr. Raylan Asau from Tonga Institute of Higher Education, and we have two friends from Nauru, Ms. Priscilla Engar and our focal point, Mrs. Darina Kuhn from Nauru again, both from the Department of Education. And then we have Mr. Kimian from, or excuse me, Mr. Kime from Kiribati Teachers College, and of course our friends from the USP. And also we have, I should also say we should have Mr. Sote Borham Ile from Tuvalu, Department of Education. So we're grateful to all of you for participating today, and again for your contributions to make this publication possible. We will be following up. The session's been recorded as well. So look for your inbox for a message from myself and from Tony in the near future. Again, thank you all. Wish you well on your day ahead, or if you're on our side, your evening ahead. So take care, everyone. Stay safe.